When does someone become a master? Is it the amount of time spent on a craft or the success you achieved with it? In this Adorama original series, we'll travel throughout the United States and discover people who spent countless hours perfecting their craft and finding their own voice. Because being a master today means being able to recognize that voice and inspire people to find their own.
I sort of have trouble putting myself into one specific box because I just kind of like to be outside and have a camera in my hand. My name is Nate Luebbe, and I am an outdoor travel adventure photographer. I love to be out in nature, maybe as far away from people as I can. And I guess I'm kind of known for, like punchier colors, more contrast, and I'm just a real fan of these like grand sweeping landscapes. I grew up in the mountains of Colorado. My dad and I are both Eagle Scouts. My mom's a super passionate, hiker and skier. And so I just grew up camping and hiking and paddling a canoe and skiing. It was just like the thing that I did every day, every weekend. I did the traditional thing. I grew up, I went to college, I got a job, and I just didn't feel fulfilled only going out on the weekends. I wanted to find a way to pursue nature every day. And eventually cell phone cameras started getting good enough that I realized I could document these weekend adventures. And I decided to start practicing. So I bought myself a real camera, went out, took a bunch of photos, and discovered a passion like that. To me, adventure photography is kind of the summary of a journey, and it doesn't have to be focused on any one thing, which makes it kind of a tough category to really define. For some people, adventure photography is extreme mountaineering and these massive landscapes and really scary looking ridges. And for other people, an adventure can be catching a taxi in Thailand, and that's the fun part about adventure. It's sort of the summary of what you see on any given journey. Somebody once described my Instagram as if Bigfoot had social media, which I've always loved. I'm a big fan of centered subjects, which I know is kind of breaking one of the rules of photography. When everything kind of lines up and you have really nice composition and framing, I'm a really big fan of that, and I've been told that's maybe a little bit of a hallmark of my style. It's really, really difficult to plan the correct gear for a big expedition or something, because you just kind of don't know exactly what you're going to get into. And so a lot of my planning is just kind of thinking about theoretical possibilities and what could happen and preparing myself for that. So I always start with, picking a location, figuring out where I want to go. Then you plan a route, and you try to plan a route that, takes me to the best possible photo locations if I'm on assignment. And then from there, it'll kind of help me narrow down my gear selection. I'll start with all of the gear I would love, and then I eliminate things that won't be super useful. I spent most of my career shooting with the A7 II and the A7R III, and they were perfect cameras for me. And then I honestly didn't think I really had any room to improve on that setup, and then the Alpha one was announced, and it just does everything. It's better in low light than the A7 II and III were, has higher resolution and faster burst speeds than the A7R III. And it's the perfect camera for me. And I also have an A7S III for low light capabilities, and the combination of those two bodies is unbeatable. And then from there, I love low light photography. So I always have either the 14mm 1.8 or the 20mm 1.8 in my bag. And probably my number one used lens is the 16-35. I just like the versatility. So if I'm going on a big hiking trip, I'll bring the 16-35 and the 70-200, and that's it. That pretty much covers me across the spectrum. If I'm on a wildlife specific shoot, I'll bring the 400mm f2.8 G Master. As far as big telephoto prime lenses go, I really just don't think it can be beat. It's the most beautiful piece of camera equipment I've ever gotten to use, honestly. As far as camera settings, for wildlife, I like to kind of keep a fast shutter for obvious reasons. You don't really want motion blur. I'll generally start with a shutter of about 1/1000th, and I'll sort of work my way backwards from there. From there, I'll think about my aperture. Do I want a thin depth of field for a lot of bokeh, or do I want to showcase the landscape behind the animal? And then once I have my aperture, my shutter speed set, then I'll think about my ISO. My wildlife photography was actually sort of incidental. I wanted to do landscapes. I would go hiking, I would go camping, and there was always just, I would see an elk or I would see a bear. And so the wildlife photography sort of just happened by accident. And that's, to me, like the ultimate show of respect, is the ability to spend time with one of these animals and not stress them out, not impact their day too much. I mean, the most complicated shot I ever took was for my film Light Side Up that came out in 2020. We sent a Sony a7S III up in a weather balloon to the stratosphere. So we photographed the Aurora Borealis from 120,000 feet over Earth. It was like 9 months of planning, and spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the film yet, we lost one of the a7S IIIs. It's still in Alaska somewhere. So I feel like it just by default has to be the most complicated photo I've ever taken, because I literally lost an entire camera system in the pursuit of taking it. But it was really a fun project and a fun challenge to try and document. One of the main challenges, I guess, was just how to get the camera up that high and recover it safely. And that was its own challenge. But then, from a photography perspective, the most difficult challenge was probably, how do you leave a camera unattended for 3.5 hours? Because, I'm not going up in the box with it. So how do I send it up there, make sure that it's going to come back with usable footage? And I think the good news was we were launching it at night, so more or less consistent lighting, but the northern lights, will fluctuate. They'll be pretty dim, and then they'll get really bright. And so we did a lot of testing with the Sony a7S III actually for auto ISO. We shot it at f1.8, lens wide open. We manually focused the lens on a star the night before, and then put the camera in the box. We taped the lens, the focus ring, so that it would never change, and then put it in the box. So it was manually focused on the star for 24 hours before it actually flew. We had batteries inside the payload with it to make sure it would stay powered. We had, almost a little over 300 gigabytes of storage in the box also to make sure that it could record the entirety of the flight. All of that combined, it all sounds individually like a challenge, but trying to deal with 20 of these smaller challenges simultaneously was really fun. It was very cold up there, so the payload was an insulating styrofoam box. And then we actually used those little chemical hand warmer packets that you tear open, you shake them up, and then you put them in there. And so our theory is that's why we lost the first one, actually, is that the hand warmers weren't enough and the GPS batteries died. And so in the second one, we beefed up our battery system and added more hand warmers. And it actually got hot enough in there for the second flight. It was probably like 70 or 80 degrees below zero. But the box was warm enough that we actually could hear the cooling fan on the camera kick in. I'm an Adobe fan, so I edit everything in Lightroom. And I don't do a ton of photoshopping, and maybe I should, I'm not really sure. I don't, though. I love to edit in Lightroom. I'll do some spot adjustments, but for me, a lot of global editing, really. I'm just a big fan of experiencing things in the moment. I'm not maybe as much of like a digital artist as a lot of photographers, and that's not a judgment call on either option. Just for me, I love to try and capture a beautiful nature experience into a still image, and so I do a lot of global editing in Adobe Lightroom. My number one tip for somebody who's trying to get into adventure photography, and this sounds a little bit contrived, but the tip is just go do it. You have to go take as many photos as you can on as many different adventures as you can. You can watch 1,000 YouTube videos and you can attend 1,000 in-person presentations and you'll understand the technical aspects, but until you're in the field experiencing what it's like to try and shoot in the moment, you really can't refine your techniques. So the number one tip is like you just have to get out and do it. And then come home and be critical of your own work. Tell yourself which photos you don't like and why. And then more importantly, tell yourself which photos you do like and why. And so I'm always trying to refine my style and my skills, but I'm trying to work towards a goal rather than run away from failures.